Picture the most powerful room on earth. Now take the man out of it. Empty the chair behind the desk. Add a closed door at the end of a long corridor. A doctor who answers every question without answering anything. And a woman in a dressing gown sitting at a bedside table, deciding which papers the President of the United States will be allowed to see. Add the smell of beeswax and coal smoke, the creak of a floorboard under a nervous usher's shoe, and a senator in the hallway shouting about petticoat government to a door that does not open. That's the White House, not once, again and again, across 2 centuries. The most watched building in America, and somehow the least seen. A place where a war could be argued over breakfast coffee and settled by a woman pouring it. A place where the country elected 1 person and got 2, and only ever found out later, if it found out at all. We're going back there tonight. Not as tourists filing past the velvet ropes looking at the portraits. We're going in through the staff entrance, down the service stairs, into the pantries and the corridors and the little offices where the real work happened. 10 women, 10 administrations, counted down from 10 to 1, ranked by a single simple measure, how much of the actual presidency was truly in her hands. Some of them worked in whispers, behind doors the country never saw open. Some worked in half light, the partnership visible, the reach of it not. I'll tell you, in each case, which was which. That's part of the story too. So, I make these history stories, and honestly, I have no clue if anyone actually sleeps to them, or if you're all just weirdos who like hearing about a senator being handled like a difficult dinner guest by a woman guarding a paralyzed president's bedroom door. Either way, subscribe if you want. Get comfortable. Here we go. First, you need to understand the rules of this particular game, because it is a game, and it has been played in the house since the paint was still wet. The Constitution of the United States mentions the president's wife exactly 0 times. She has no salary. She takes no oath. No one can impeach her, because officially there is nothing to impeach her from. For most of American history, she could not even vote for the husband she was advising. On paper, she is a hostess. She picks the china. She stands in the receiving line. She smiles, and that is precisely what made the position so dangerous and so powerful, because a cabinet secretary can be fired, a senator can be voted out, a chief of staff serves at the president's pleasure. But the woman who shares the president's breakfast, who reads his face across the dinner table, who hears him talking in his sleep, she serves at nobody's pleasure. She's there before the advisors arrive and after they leave. She is the first opinion of the morning and the last opinion of the night. And the last opinion of the night, any White House staffer will tell you, is the one that usually wins. The people who saw this happen were not journalists. Journalists waited at the gates. The people who saw it were the ushers, the maids, the cooks, the doormen, the clerks, the stewards, the household staff, some of them serving 30 and 40 years across a dozen administrations, trained to see everything and to say nothing. Their memoirs, their letters, their testimony are how we know most of what you're about to hear. So tonight, that's who you'll be. 10 times you'll stand where they stood, in your polished shoes and your pressed uniform, holding a tray or a mail sack or a stack of newspapers, watching the unofficial presidency operate at close range. One honest word before we begin. The rooms are real, the dates are real, the documents are real. The eyes I'm lending you, this particular steward, that particular maid, are composites stitched together from the staff who actually stood there and wrote it down, ranked from 10 to 1, from influence half hidden in plain sight to something very close to a secret administration. Every date real, every claim documented, the gossip left at the door where it belongs. Number 10. You're a steward aboard the presidential yacht Williamsburg, anchored in the Potomac River on a warm evening in the spring of 1947, and you are trying to pour coffee without making a sound. The cup is White House china, thin as an eggshell, and it rattles against the saucer with every small movement of the deck. The river slaps softly against the hull. Somewhere below the generators hum. The air on the afterdeck smells of brass polish and river water, and the president's after-dinner bourbon, which he has barely touched. President Harry Truman is reading aloud. He has a speech draft in his hands, typed pages with wide margins, and he's delivering it to an audience of exactly one. A grey-haired woman in a plain dress sitting perfectly straight in a deck chair, her hands folded, her face giving away nothing at all. Bess Truman. You've been told in the way stewards are told things, half instruction, half warning, that you do not interrupt this. You refill the coffee when the cups are empty. You keep your eyes on the tray, and you do not, under any circumstances, appear to be listening. You listen anyway. Everyone does. The president reads a paragraph. It's a good paragraph, you think. Rolling. A little grand. The kind of sentence that sounds like marble. Mrs. Truman's mouth tightens by perhaps a quarter of an inch. The president stops mid-sentence. He doesn't ask what's wrong. He just looks at her over the top of his glasses, and she says quietly that no living human being talks that way, and that he certainly doesn't, and that the sentence should come out. The sentence comes out. He draws a pencil line through it right there on his knee and keeps reading. You pour the coffee, your hands are steadier now, and you file away what you have just seen because it is the whole story in miniature. The President of the United States, the man who ended a world war, submitting his words for approval and getting edits. Here is what was actually true about Bess Wallace Truman. The partnership itself was never hidden. Harry announced it in his plain Missouri way to anyone who asked. What stayed behind closed doors was the working of it, what she actually said, and how often he obeyed. Harry Truman called her the boss. He'd been calling her that for years since Missouri, and the press treated it as a husband's joke. The staff knew better. Over the course of their marriage, he wrote her something like 1,300 letters, courtship letters, Senate letters, White House letters, and when you read them now, what's striking isn't the romance, it's the content, politics, appointments, strategy, doubts. He showed no one else. He wasn't writing to his wife the way men of his generation were supposed to write to wives about the weather and the garden. He was reporting to a partner. He said so himself, in plain words, the way Truman said everything. She was, he told people, a full partner in all his transactions, politically and otherwise. He said he never delivered a major speech without going over it with her first. He said he discussed every important decision with her, because her judgment was better than that of half the men around him, and he was not entirely joking about which half. And when I say she edited his speeches, I need you to understand what that means in the Truman White House. This isn't a wife glancing at a draft and saying it's wonderful, dear. This is a woman with a sharp ear and a sharper pencil, going through presidential addresses line by line, cutting the pomp, flattening the flourishes, striking out the profanity. Harry had a barnyard vocabulary and she policed it like a border, until what remained sounded like the plain, flat, honest Missouri voice the whole country came to trust. That voice won the 1948 election. The one every poll and every newspaper said he'd lose. The voice was Harry's. The discipline of it was substantially Bess. She did all this while giving the public almost nothing. After Eleanor Roosevelt's press conferences, and we will get to Eleanor Roosevelt, reporters assumed the new First Lady would carry on the tradition. Bess declined. Pressed, she agreed to answer written questions, and her answers came back like telegrams from a fortress. Asked what she wanted to do after the White House, she wrote, "Return to Independence, Missouri." Asked if she wanted her daughter to become president someday. No. Asked what had prepared her for the role of First Lady. Silence was the answer to that one. A reporter once asked what she thought the place of a woman in public life should be, and the answer attributed to her has been quoted ever since. That a woman's place in public was to sit beside her husband, be silent, and be sure her hat was on straight. Read that again, slowly, and notice what it is. It isn't submission, it's camouflage. Because behind the hat and the silence, the partnership never stopped. Margaret Truman, their daughter, wrote later that there was exactly one major decision of his presidency Harry did not discuss with Bess in advance. The atomic bomb sealed off from her by wartime secrecy, and that Bess was genuinely angry about it. Angry about being left out of that. That tells you what the normal arrangement was for everything else. The Marshall Plan years, the Whistle Stop campaign, the firing of General Douglas MacArthur in April 1951, the daily grinding decisions of the early Cold War, all of it turned over, evening after evening, in a sitting room with the door closed, between the president and the one advisor who could not be fired, transferred, or leaked against. From November 1948 until March 1952, they didn't even live in the White House proper. The old house was collapsing. A leg of Margaret's piano had broken through a rotten floor. Engineers found the whole interior held up by habit and luck. So the family moved across Pennsylvania Avenue into Blair House, while the mansion was gutted down to its stone shell and rebuilt from the inside, which means some of the most consequential conversations of the 20th century happen not in the West Wing but in a borrowed townhouse, over the dinner dishes, between a man from Independence and a woman from Independence who had known him since Sunday school. The staff who served them in those cramped rooms saw it every day. He asked. She answered. He listened. Nobody voted for her. She would have been horrified by the suggestion. But when the President of the United States calls one person the boss for 40 years, at some point you have to stop treating it as a joke. She sits at number 10 not because her influence was small, but because it stayed at the near end of tonight's spectrum, acknowledged in principle, invisible in practice, and never once reaching past her husband to touch the machinery itself. The 9 women ahead of her reached. Number 9. You're a hired waiter in the President's house in Washington City on a Wednesday evening in the winter of 1812, and you have been warned about the crush. They warned you, and you didn't believe them, and now you're pressed against a wall of the drawing room with a tray of ice cream. Actual ice cream in winter, a luxury so strange that guests keep asking you what it is, while what feels like half the government of the United States packs itself into rooms built for a quarter of that number. The heat of the candles and the bodies has fogged the tall windows. The air smells of melting wax, wet wool, hair powder, and the oyster suppers laid out in the next room. Somebody's elbow finds your ribs. Somebody's boot finds your foot. A Supreme Court justice is wedged against a doorframe like a man in a stagecoach. They call these evenings Mrs. Madison's squeezes, and everyone in the city who matters, and everyone who wants to matter, is here, and through the middle of it all moves the reason. You see the turban first, because it's designed to be seen first. Bright silk, wrapped high, sometimes topped with feathers, on a tall woman in her 40s who moves through the crowd like warm water. Dolly Madison. She has a snuff box in one hand, which scandalizes some of the clergymen's wives and charms absolutely everyone else, and she is doing something you have never seen anyone do before. She's remembering people, not just names, circumstances. She greets a freshman congressman from the Western country, a man nobody else in the room has bothered with, standing stiff in a coat cut 5 years out of fashion, and she asks after his wife by name and his district by its troubles. And within 90 seconds the man has been introduced to a committee chairman, a newspaper editor, and a bank director. And Mrs. Madison has already moved on, leaving him permanently, gratefully hers. You watch her do this for 3 hours. It never stops. It never looks like work. Her husband is in the room too. President James Madison, small, pale, dressed in black, brilliant and nearly inaudible, standing in a corner talking quietly with 2 men about something that is almost certainly Latin. Guests describe him, unkindly but not inaccurately, as a withered little apple John beside his wife. He is one of the great political minds of the age, and a near catastrophe at a party. And both of these things matter, because in Washington in 1812 the party is not a break from politics. The party is the politics. Here is what was actually happening in those overheated rooms, and why historians take it seriously. The Washington of the Madison presidency, 1809 to 1817, was a swamp-edged village pretending to be a capital. Muddy avenues, boarding houses full of quarrelsome congressmen, no theatres to speak of, nothing that resembled society. The government was new, raw, and split into factions that genuinely hated each other, and there was no neutral ground anywhere in the city where a Federalist and a Republican could stand in the same room without it being a declaration. Dolly Madison built the neutral ground. She held her first drawing room on the 31st of May, 1809, and then every Wednesday the doors opened to both parties at once, a radical act and a deliberate one. Thomas Jefferson, a widower, had spent 8 years hosting small, controlled dinners for one faction at a time. Dolly threw the house open and let the factions marinate together in candlelight and ice cream until they could at least pretend to be countrymen. Congressmen made deals at her squeezes that they could not be seen making anywhere else. Diplomats measured the temperature of the administration by who she smiled at. And patronage, the jobs, the postmasterships, the commissions that were the actual currency of the young republic, flowed through her hands in a way everyone understood and no one wrote down officially. A widow needing a clerkship for her son did not petition the president. She wrote to Mrs. Madison. The files of surviving letters show it, request after request, and show her answering. And mark the line between the two halves, because it matters for tonight's measure. The squeezes were the most public events in America. Anyone could watch her work a room. The correspondence behind them, the steady traffic of favours and offices moving under her signature, was the part nobody was meant to see, and that is the part that puts her on this list. Henry Clay, who knew political power the way a fish knows water, put it simply, everybody loves Mrs. Madison, and her recorded reply is the most efficient explanation of soft power ever spoken in that house. That's because Mrs. Madison loves everybody. It sounds sweet. It was strategy. In the poisonous election season of 1812, with the country sliding into war with Great Britain and Madison's own party fracturing, Her rooms were where the administration's coalition was physically held together, week after week, hand by hand, name by name. There were men in Washington who said openly that Madison won re-election that year in his wife's drawing room. They were exaggerating, not by much. And then came the day that turned a hostess into a legend, and it is documented from multiple directions, including by someone who was standing in the room. The 24th of August, 1814. The war has come home. A British army has landed in Maryland and is marching on Washington. And the American militia sent to stop it at Bladensburg has broken and run so fast the battle will be remembered as a foot race. President Madison is out of the city, with the army. In the president's house the tables have been absurdly, defiantly set for a dinner party of 40. Cooked meats, wine in the coolers. Because Dolly Madison has refused all day to behave like a woman about to lose her home. She stands at the windows with a spyglass, watching the road, waiting for her husband, while the sound that carries in from the northeast is cannon. Around 3 in the afternoon, the last riders come through shouting that the army is beaten and the British are coming, and now, only now, she consents to go. And in the minutes she has left, with wagons scarce, and the city emptying around her, she makes her choice about what the Republic can afford to lose. Her belongings can burn. The full-length Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington in the dining room cannot, because she understands, faster than most of the generals that day, that there is a difference between losing a building and losing a symbol. The portrait's frame is screwed to the wall, and the screws won't give. So at her order the frame is broken apart, the canvas taken out, and the painting sent away into the countryside with 2 gentlemen from New York, hours before British officers eat the dinner still warm on her table and then burn the house to a shell. We know the scene in that room partly from her own letter to her sister, written as it happened, and partly from Paul Jennings, a young enslaved footman in the Madison household who was there that day, and who published his memoir in 1865, the first insider account of the White House ever written. Cross-checked against each other, the accounts agree on what matters. While the government of the United States was running, she was directing a salvage operation. The British burned the house down to blackened stone, and here is the detail that tells you what she actually was. When the government crept back to the ruined city, and there were serious men seriously proposing to abandon Washington altogether and move the capital somewhere safer, the Madisons took a mansion on the corner called the Octagon House, and within weeks the Wednesday drawing room started again. Same crowd, same candles, same woman moving through it, remembering everyone. The message did not need to be spoken. The capital stays, the government stands. Madam is receiving. Congress voted to stay and rebuild. You cannot give her all the credit for that. You cannot give her none of it. She held no office for a single day of her life. She built the social machine that made the American government function, ran it for 8 years, saved its most sacred object from a fire, and steadied the capital through the worst humiliation in its history. All of it with a snuff box in one hand and a guest list in the other. That's number 9. And if it seems strange to rank a legend this low, remember the measure we're using tonight. Rooms and reputations were her instruments. The women ahead of her got closer to the paperwork. Number 8. Cold. First. Before you're even properly awake, before you remember which house this is, the cold finds you. A wet, riverine, bone-deep November cold that no fire in this building seems able to push back. You're a housemaid in the President's house, in the brand new federal city of Washington. It is late November of the year 1800, and the President's house is not finished. And when I say not finished, I need you to understand what that means, because the words President's House suggest something grand, and what you're working in is a construction site with furniture. The plaster on the walls is still wet. You can smell it, that raw lime smell that catches in your throat, and wet plaster in November means the whole enormous building sweats cold. Of the 30-some rooms, perhaps 6 are habitable. There is no main staircase yet. The carpenters haven't built it. There are not enough lamps for the hall, so you carry your candle everywhere, one hand cupped around the flame against draughts that come from everywhere and nowhere. Firewood is scarce, which should be impossible. The house sits at the edge of an actual forest, but there is no one to cut it and no one to haul it, and so the President's house, the first house of the nation, is short of wood in winter. The bell rings. You climb the servants' stair with your candle, and you find the First Lady of the United States in the great unfinished audience room, the vast echoing chamber at the East End that will someday host kings. And she is doing something with the space that is either practical genius or quiet sacrilege. Depending on which of the other servants you ask, she is hanging laundry in it. Lines strung across the grandest room in America. The president's shirts and the household linen dripping onto the bare boards, because Abigail Adams has surveyed this half-born city and determined that there is nowhere else, no yard, no proper drying ground, nothing outside but mud, tree stumps and brick kilns. And she's 56 years old. She's run farms and households through a war and a revolution, and she's not going to let ceremony interfere with clean linen. She catches your eye. She almost smiles. She tells you where to hang the next line. You will remember this your whole life, that the First Lady ever to live in the White House used the East Room as a drying yard. What you cannot see from your side of the laundry line is what she does after the household goes dark. She writes. She sits at a small desk with her inkwell close to the candle, because the ink thickens in the cold, and she writes letters. To her sister Mary, to her son Thomas, to her cousins, to half of Massachusetts. And those letters are not chatter. They are political intelligence of a quality the professionals in this city would kill for. Who is scheming against her husband inside his own cabinet, and she names them accurately. What the newspapers are preparing, what Hamilton's faction intends, what the French crisis actually signifies beneath what the dispatches say. Analysis, prediction, judgment, sentence after sentence in a fast, firm hand, page after page, night after night, in a freezing house at the edge of a forest. She's been doing this for 40 years. Here is the documented shape of it. Abigail Smith married John Adams in October of 1764, and across the 4 decades that followed, through the Revolution, through his years as a diplomat in Paris and London, through the vice presidency and the presidency, the two of them exchanged well over 1,000 letters that survive to this day. You can read them, whole archives of them, and what they show is not a marriage that occasionally touched on politics. They show a 2-person political operation that occasionally touched on domestic matters. In March of 1776, with independence not yet even declared, she was already writing him the letter every American schoolchild now knows. Remember the ladies, she told him. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Pressing the framers of a new nation from her kitchen table on the rights of half its population. He laughed it off in his reply. She did not laugh. She never stopped making the argument. By the time John Adams became the 2nd President of the United States in March of 1797, the partnership was so complete that he could not function without it. This is not a poetic exaggeration. It is nearly a direct quotation. His letters to her when she was away at the farm in Quincy, and she was away for long stretches managing the family's entire economy, because John was brilliant with nations and hopeless with money, turn anxious, then pleading. He tells her he must have her there. He tells her things go wrong without her. The President of the United States writing to his wife in substance, "I can do nothing without you." And Washington knew it. The capital, Philadelphia first, then the raw new city, talked. Her husband's political enemies gave her a nickname, and they did not mean it kindly. They called her Mrs. President. So understand what the secret was here, because it was never her influence. The whole capital assumed that, joked about it, printed it. The secret was the channel itself. What actually passed between them, in ink, at night, which no one outside the letters would read for a century. Albert Gallatin, the sharpest man in the opposition, sharpened the insult further. Mrs. President, he said, not of the United States, but of a faction. Think about what an insult like that concedes. You do not bother inventing a title for a woman who merely pours the tea. The opposition coined it because they had watched, session after session, as the president's positions arrived pre-argued, because they knew, everyone knew, that the last voice John Adams heard on any question was his wife's, and that her voice was harder than his. She was fiercer than the president on nearly every front. When the vicious partisan press savaged her husband, and the press of the 1790s makes ours look gentle, they called him old, toothless, mad, a hermaphroditical tyrant. She raged where he brooded, and when the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 gave the government power to jail its newspaper tormentors, she was for them, openly, in letter after letter, more warmly than John ever dared be in public. History has judged those laws a disgrace, and her support for them is part of her record too. We said every claim tonight would be documented. The documents do not only show her wisdom, but they show the reach. Appointments discussed. Messages to Congress read to her before delivery. Foreign policy, the whole agonizing question of war or peace with France, the question that consumed and finally broke the Adams presidency, turned over between them relentlessly. In 1798, with the country howling for war, she was in the room, in the correspondence, in the argument. When John finally made the loneliest decision of his life in 1799 and sent a peace mission to France against the fury of his own party, the decision that cost him re-election and that he forever called his proudest act, the one adviser who had been with him at every step was not in the cabinet. The cabinet, he discovered, was secretly working for Hamilton. His actual cabinet had been with him since 1764. She lived in the president's house for only 4 months. She arrived in November 1800 to that wet plaster and those 13 fires they kept burning against the damp, and she wrote her famous, funny, devastating letters home about it. The great unfinished castle, the laundry in the audience room, and even then, cold and tired and heartsick over her son Charles, who was dying of drink in New York that same terrible month, she kept writing politics. That December the returns came in, and John lost the presidency to Thomas Jefferson. In February she packed the house she had never finished moving into. On her last morning she could reread her husband's prayer for the place. The benediction John had written her on his second night under that unfinished roof, that none but honest and wise men might ever rule beneath it. The line a later century would carve into the state dining-room mantel. Then she went home to Quincy, and the couple wrote fewer letters after that. for the best of reasons. For the first time in 40 years, they were finally in the same room. She sits at number 8 because her power ran through exactly one channel, her husband's mind, but ran through it so completely that his enemies gave her his title. The women ahead of her needed no nickname. They had duties. Number 7. You're an usher at the White House on the morning of the 4th of March, 1909, and the capital of the United States has disappeared under snow. 10 inches of it fell overnight, on top of wind that snapped telegraph poles like kindling and stranded trains in drifts up and down the eastern seaboard. Washington has been cut off from the rest of the country. Workmen have been shoveling Pennsylvania Avenue since before dawn. Thousands of them, city crews and hired men, moving what the newspapers will call tons of snow with a number in the tens of thousands. And the inauguration of William Howard Taft, which was to happen gloriously outdoors at the Capitol, has been driven inside to the Senate chamber for the first time in living memory. Outgoing President Theodore Roosevelt, never able to resist a line, jokes that he knew there would be a blizzard when he went out. You're at the door doing what ushers do on transition day, which is everything at once. Stamping snow off boots, managing trunks, holding the door against the wind. And it is at this door, in the middle of the storm, that you get your first look at the new First Lady and your first lesson in who she is. Helen Heron Taft, Nellie to her family, comes through the entrance with snow on her collar and an expression you will come to know very well over the next 4 years. Not flustered by the chaos, inventorying it. Her eyes go around the entrance hall like an auditor's, and within days you will feel the results, because one of the first things she does in this house is reorganize the staff itself. The position of steward, a man's position, always, she abolishes and installs instead a housekeeper, a quiet, competent woman named Elizabeth Jaffray, answering on household matters to Mrs. Taft. The ushers are put into livery. The daily accounts are gone over. Nothing about the change is dramatic, and everything about it is unmistakable. There is new management, but the moment history remembers from that snow-blind day happens away from your door, on the avenue. By afternoon the storm has broken, and the sun is out on 10 inches of trampled slush, and the new president rides back from the Capitol to the White House in an open landau, and beside him, in the carriage seat that for 120 years has belonged to a man, sits his wife. No First Lady has ever done it. The seat beside a newly sworn president on that ride belongs by iron custom to the outgoing president or some appropriate dignitary, and Theodore Roosevelt has broken tradition himself by leaving town straight from the Capitol, and into that opening, before any official can think to fill it, steps Nellie Taft. She wrote about the moment later with total candour. It was the part of the inauguration she had wanted for herself, and some of the officials on the scene were aghast, and she did not care. She had, she said, a secret elation. Watch that carriage roll up the snow-banked avenue, the crowds cheering, the woman beside the president looking straight ahead, and understand what you're actually seeing. This is not a wife enjoying her husband's day. This is a woman riding in triumph at the completion of a 20-year project. Because here is the consistent testimony of the people around them about the Taft presidency. It was her idea. William Howard Taft did not want to be president. He wanted to be a judge. Specifically, he wanted to be Chief Justice of the United States, and he said so plainly for decades. The bench was his idea of heaven, the presidency his idea of a nightmare. And more than once in his rising career, the offer of a seat on the Supreme Court was actually in his hands. Nellie argued him out of it. A judgeship, she understood, was a beautiful dead end. The White House was the summit, and she had had the summit in view since she was a girl in Cincinnati, since a visit to the Hayes White House at 17, after which she told friends, in the kind of joke that isn't one, that she intended to marry a man who could take her back there. When Theodore Roosevelt dangled the court again while Taft was Governor General of the Philippines, it was Nellie who fought the appointment. Nellie who went, herself personally, to see President Roosevelt about her husband's future. When the 1908 nomination hung in the air, it was Nellie pressing forward while Will privately dreamed of robes. The men around the administration understood the arrangement perfectly. Captain Archibald Butt, the military aide whose thousands of pages of letters are one of our best windows into that White House, watched the couple at close range daily and recorded the dynamic without ever quite needing to name it. Her will, his amiable drift, the steady pressure of her ambition underneath his career like a current under a barge. So when she took the seat in the carriage, she was not borrowing his triumph, she was collecting. And then she went to work, and for 4 astonishing months you, the usher, watched something happen that had no precedent in that building. The First Lady sat in. Political conferences in the President's study. She came, she listened, she stayed. Discussions of appointments. She had opinions, sharp ones, and delivered them. She read the newspapers like an analyst, distrusted several of the men around her husband with what proved to be excellent judgment, and told him so, where prior First Ladies governed the House. Nellie Taft plainly intended to help govern the administration, and in the early spring of 1909 nobody could see a limit to it. The state dinners ran to her standard. The White House stables gave way, on her order, to automobiles. She put twin beds in the presidential bedroom and a cow on the White House lawn, and if any usher smiled about either, he did it well out of her sight. 74 days. That is how long that presidency of 2 lasted. On the 17th of May, 1909, the presidential yacht Sylph steams down the Potomac on a pleasant spring outing, the First Lady aboard with a small party. Somewhere on that stretch of river, quietly, catastrophically, a vessel bursts in her brain. A stroke. At 47. It takes her speech. The right side of her face, the arm. The woman who argued a reluctant man into the presidency cannot by that evening reliably form a word. What follows never made the papers, because the White House made sure it didn't. The public was told of a nervous attack, an indisposition, a need for rest. Inside the house you see the truth every day, and it is one of the strangest and most tender chapters in the building's history. The President of the United States, 300 pounds of him, the busiest man in America, comes upstairs in the evenings, sits beside his wife, and teaches her to speak again, sound by sound, word by word. Patient as a man who spent his whole soul on patience. Now, darling, he says, try it again. The staff learn to schedule around these sessions as if they were cabinet meetings, because to him they matter more, and she comes back. That is the part of Nellie Taft that the stroke revealed rather than destroyed. Through the summer at Beverly, through the following winter, she claws her speech back syllable by syllable, returns to the dinner table, resumes the reins of the household, and by 1911 she is planning the biggest social event the White House has ever seen. The Tafts' silver wedding anniversary in June, 8,000 guests on the lawn under strings of electric lights. The political partnership never fully recovers. The 4 months when she sat in on the conferences stay a might have been. and some historians will always wonder how differently Taft's disastrous drift from Roosevelt might have gone with Nellie at full strength beside him, because she'd never trusted the men who engineered the break. But she left a mark on the Capitol that outlasts every appointment she ever influenced. She'd lived in Manila in the Philippine years and loved the Luneta, the waterside park where the whole city, rich and poor, promenaded in the evenings to band music. And she decided Washington deserved the same. She created it. Potomac Drive, concerts and carriages by the river. And to line the water, she reached back to a Japanese scene she loved and pushed through the planting of cherry trees. The first shipment arrived diseased and had to be burned, all 2,000 of them. A small diplomatic catastrophe. The mayor of Tokyo sent 3,000 more. On the 27th of March, 1912, Helen Taft and the Viscountess Chinda, wife of the Japanese ambassador, turned Earth together and planted the first 2 trees on the north bank of the tidal basin. Those 2 trees are still alive. Every spring, when the whole basin goes up in pink smoke and 1 million people come to stand under it, they are standing inside the imagination of a woman who ran her husband's career for 20 years, sat in on his conferences for 74 days, lost her voice, and got it back. Number 6. The tray is heavier than it looks. You're a houseman on the 2nd floor of the White House on a winter night in 1922, carrying glasses, ice, seltzer, and bottles up the private stairs, and the bottles are the reason your palms are sweating, because every one of them is illegal. This is the 3rd year of Prohibition. It is a federal crime to manufacture, sell, or transport intoxicating liquor anywhere in the United States, a law this administration is sworn constitutionally, personally, publicly to enforce. And you are carrying a full bar service toward the president's study, where the Tuesday and Friday poker game is in session, and the smell reaches you before the door does. Cigar smoke in a fog you could lean on, whiskey, cards, the particular laughter of powerful men who are completely at ease. You knock. The door opens on the study. The President of the United States in his shirt sleeves with a cigar and a hand of cards, and around the table the men the newspapers call the Ohio Gang, the Attorney General of the United States among them, which, given the contents of your tray, is its own kind of joke. Senators, fixers, the purple-faced warmth of the room. And moving through it, directing it, is a woman in pince-nez glasses with a black velvet band at her throat. A woman with a marcelled grey pompadour and quick, restless energy. And she is doing something that will lodge in your memory for the rest of your life, because of what it is and where it is. The wife of the President of the United States is mixing the drinks. She takes your tray. She thanks you by name. She knows all the staff by name, keeps track of birthdays and sick children, which is one reason the staff forgive her the sharp side of her tongue. And the door closes, and you stand a moment in the corridor absorbing it. What you have just seen is documented, and not by a servant's rumour. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Theodore's daughter, the most feared social intelligence in Washington, attended those evenings and set the scene down in her memoir. The air heavy with tobacco smoke, the trays of bottles bearing every imaginable brand of whiskey, the cards and poker chips at hand, and Florence Harding moving among the president's cronies, mixing the drinks. In the middle of Prohibition, upstairs at the White House. Her husband calls her the Duchess. He has called her that for 30 years, and like Truman calling Bess the boss, everybody hears it as banter, and the people who know the couple hear it as a job description. Because here is the documented spine of Florence Kling Harding's life. She built him. Marion, Ohio, the 1890s. Florence Kling, daughter of the hardest businessman in town, divorced, a single mother who had taught piano lessons at 50 cents apiece to feed her son, marries Warren Harding, the handsome, genial, chronically unhurried owner of a struggling small-town newspaper called the Marion Star. And then, one day, almost casually, she walks into the Star's offices to help out for a few days while the circulation manager is away. She stays 14 years. She takes over the circulation department entirely. The money end, the subscriptions, the delivery boys, the accounts, and she runs it like her father's daughter. The delivery boys, one of them a young Norman Thomas, the future 6-time socialist candidate for president, remember her for the rest of their lives, exacting, formidable, fair. She squeezes the paper's finances into order, builds the subscriber rolls, turns a debt-ridden sheet into the prosperous voice of a growing town. Warren provides the geniality and the editorials. Florence provides the discipline and the ledgers. It is the whole future administration in miniature, run out of a storefront in Marion, his handsome ease out front, her iron bookkeeping in the back room, and she aims him. Upward step by step, State Senate, Lieutenant Governor, the 1914 United States Senate race, managing his image, his schedule, his correspondence, his weaknesses, of which she has no illusions because she has catalogued them. When the deadlocked 1920 Republican convention in Chicago finally swings to Harding in a smoke-filled room, and the question comes whether he wants a nomination that will expose every corner of his private life, the accounts of that night agree on where the resolve came from. And there is a story from that circle, a story told and retold, quoted in the American Heritage accounts and the biographies ever since, famous precisely because everyone who knew them believed it, of the culmination. Florence Harding looks at her husband, now the most powerful man on earth, and says, "Well, Warren Harding, I have got you the presidency. What are you going to do with it? Not we, not fate. I have got you the presidency." Once inside the White House in March of 1921, she runs the place with the same circulation desk energy, and not just the household. She reads his speeches and edits them, cut the fine phrases she tells him in substance, say it plain. She sits in on discussions no First Lady since Nellie Taft has been near. She answers correspondence in bulk, personally, hundreds of letters, because she believes, correctly, a generation before anyone else acts on it, that the public's mail is the public's voice. She throws the White House gates open again after the Wilson years, garden parties for thousands, and works the lines herself until her ankles swell, because she and she alone in that administration understands that the presidency is now a mass media object. She poses him, paces him, manages the newsreel men, befriends the reporters, stages the photographs. The first thoroughly modern political image operation in White House history is run by a 60-year-old woman in pince-nez. She has her superstitions, an astrologer in Washington, Madame Marcia, whom she consulted even before the nomination, and who told her, the story goes, that her husband would win the presidency and not survive it. Hold that thought. It is not the last astrologer in this countdown, and she has her cause, the truest thing in her, the veterans, the wounded boys of the World War, whom she calls her boys, and means it. She haunts the hospital wards, writes to mothers, badgers the bureaucracy. When the new Veterans Bureau is created in 1921, its director Charles Forbes, charming, energetic, a favourite of Florence's circle, takes charge of hundreds of millions of dollars meant for her boys' hospitals. And this is where the ledger of Florence Harding stops balancing, because Forbes steals it. Not all of it, but scandalous vast amounts. The hospital contracts padded, the medical supplies sold out the back door. One of the ugliest betrayals in the history of the federal government, aimed precisely at the men she loved most. Forbes will eventually go to prison. Her Ohio gang evenings, those warm smoky nights you carried the trays to, turn out to have been the social club of one of the most corrupt circles ever to surround an American president. The Attorney General at that poker table will be twice tried. The Interior Secretary, Albert Fall, remember that name, you will hear it again tonight at a locked bedroom door, will become the first cabinet officer in American history to go to prison for Teapot Dome. There is no evidence Florence took $1. There is every evidence she helped build the machine the thieves rode in on, and guarded the man at the centre of it, and read the warning signs late. She was reading them, though, at the end. In the summer of 1923, with the scandals beginning to smoke under the floorboards, the Hardings leave Washington on a grand transcontinental tour, out through the West, up to the Alaska Territory, the first president ever to visit it, and the staff on that train watch Harding grey and failing, sleepless, asking a cabinet member what a president should do when he learns his friends have betrayed him. In San Francisco, at the Palace Hotel, on the evening of the 2nd of August 1923, Florence is reading to him from a flattering magazine article. "That's good, go on," he says, by the accounts of the room, and somewhere in the next moments the president's heart stops. With his wife's voice the last sound of his life. She rode the funeral train back across the continent through crowds singing his favourite hymns, and she survived him by only 15 months. And history's verdict on her is double, and both halves are true. The Harding administration stands as one of the most corrupt of its century, and the woman who built it, the divorced piano teacher from Marion who ran the money, made the man, got him the presidency with her own hands and asked him to his face what he intended to do with it, held more real operating power day to day than almost any first lady before her. She knew it too. She once put the entire arrangement into a single sentence. The way she put everything, "I know what's best for the president. I put him in the White House." Number 5. Your boots are loud on the empty avenue. You are a newspaper messenger in Washington City before dawn on a morning in the autumn of 1846, and your job is simple. Deliver the bundle of morning papers to the White House door, hand them across, and be gone before the city wakes. There is a war on. The United States has been at war with Mexico since May of this year, and the papers under your arm are fat with it. Dispatches from the Rio Grande, casualty lists, editorials for and against, the whole country arguing with itself at 2 cents a copy. The sky is still black, the great house is a grey shape behind its trees, and every morning without fail one window on the upper floor is already lit. You used to think it was the president's window. President James Knox Polk is famous for working the way other men breathe. He will spend barely 6 weeks away from his desk in 4 full years, and he is grinding himself into his grave in that house, visibly, month by month. But the doorman put you right one morning in the way doormen do, with a jerk of the thumb toward the lit window. That's not him, he told you. That's her. She reads them first. Her. Sarah Childress Polk. Hand your papers across the threshold and follow them, invisibly, up through the sleeping house to where the lamplight is. There she sits, in her black hair and her plain dark morning dress. 43 years old, childless, tireless, a Presbyterian moderator's dream, and a Washington hostess of surprising charm when she chooses to deploy it, and in front of her the newspapers of the United States, and in her hand a pen. Watch what she does, because no First Lady before her has ever done it as a daily discipline of state. She reads the papers the way a staff officer reads dispatches. She marks them. This column the President must see. A line beside it, the page folded. This attack he must answer. This rumour from the Senate means Cass is moving. This editor has switched sides. This casualty list will reach Tennessee before the official letters do. The pile on the left becomes a pile on the right. By the time James Polk sits down to his breakfast, the enormous roar of the American press has been distilled by one unpaid, unappointed, unacknowledged analyst into the morning's essential intelligence, marked and ranked and laid beside his plate. Now understand what surrounds that little scene, because this is what lifts Sarah Polk to number 5, above the influences, into the machinery itself. James K. Polk ran the presidency, 1845 to 1849, with a staff that would not adequately serve a modern small-town mayor. His entire official secretariat was essentially one man, his nephew by marriage, J. Knox Walker, for a government fighting a foreign war, annexing Texas, facing down Britain over Oregon, and remaking the tariff and the treasury. The paperwork of the presidency in those years was a physical tide. Correspondence, office seekers' petitions, war dispatches, drafts, memoranda, and the person who worked beside him in it, hour after hour, day after day for 4 years, was his wife. The arrangement was unofficial and unacknowledged rather than hidden. The people who knew them knew, and it had been the shape of the marriage from the beginning. Sarah Childress had been educated at the Moravian Female Academy in Salem, North Carolina, about the finest formal education available to a woman in America in the 1810s, and the courtship legend in Tennessee always held that Andrew Jackson himself had nudged the young Polk toward her. When Polk was Speaker of the House, Sarah ran his Washington correspondence. When he campaigned for governor of Tennessee, she managed communications from Columbia like an adjutant. By the presidential campaign of 1844, the division of labor was fixed, and everyone in their world knew it. Asked during the campaign, pointedly by a supporter of the incumbent, whether she could match Mrs. Tyler's housekeeping, Sarah answered, with the campaign's coldest, most quotable line. If she and her husband reached the White House, she said, she would neither keep house nor make butter. She kept that promise precisely. The housekeeping was delegated. The statecraft was not. In the White House, she copied his correspondence, drafted in his name, managed which papers reached his desk and in what order. The same quiet, choke-point power you will see again tonight, at its terrifying maximum, at number 1. She sat with him in the evenings as he emptied his mind of the day. The cabinet quarrels, the generals he distrusted, Scott and Taylor, both Whigs, both possible rivals, both winning his war for him. And he trusted her judgment of men above almost anyone's because her judgment was better. Congressmen learned that a word to Mrs. Polk reached the president faster than a formal letter, and reached him framed by her view of the sender. Franklin Pierce, a future president himself, said he preferred talking politics with Sarah Polk to talking with almost anyone, and that fragment survives because the men of that Washington kept finding themselves saying versions of it, half amused, half unsettled. The president's wife talks policy, knows the tariff argument, quotes your own speech back at you. She ruled the social house with the same deliberateness, and even her famous prohibitions were policy. No dancing at the White House. She banned it. Hard liquor gone from the receptions, wine remaining at dinners, no entertainments on the Sabbath. The Capitol grumbled and called the administration dour, and Sarah, who understood exactly what she was doing, let it grumble. The bans bought the administration the loyalty of the vast church-going middle of the country, cost it nothing that mattered, and inoculated a workaholic presidency against the one charge, frivolity, that could never now be made to stick. A guest is supposed to have complained that her receptions were austere, and the reply attributed to her stands as her theory of the office in one line. She was, she said, determined that the White House under her care would be respected, and she would add, on the question of economy, that she and the President were public servants living on the public's money and would spend accordingly. And the war ground on, and her husband ground down. This is the dark background of every lamplit morning in that house. James Polk is succeeding himself to death. In 4 years he takes the continent, Texas secured, the Oregon boundary settled with Britain on the 49th parallel in 1846, and by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in February 1848, the entire vast southwest California to New Mexico added to the United States. No president between the founders and Lincoln changes the map more, and the man who does it sleeps less each month, greys and shrinks inside his clothes, and the staff and the visitors all see it, and the person managing the flow of work to that failing engine, rationing what she can, absorbing what he cannot, is Sarah. He keeps his promise to serve a single term. They leave Washington in March of 1849, travel home toward Tennessee by boat through a South where cholera is burning along the rivers, and reach Nashville with James already ailing. 103 days after leaving the presidency, on the 15th of June, 1849, James K. Polk dies at 53, the shortest retirement of any president in American history. His will, his words, his last recorded thoughts circle around Sarah. None but Sarah, he had written of his private affairs, knew so intimately his heart and his business. She wore black for him for 42 years. She kept their home, Polk Place, as a kind of national shrine, received visitors from both sides through the entire Civil War. Union and Confederate commanders alike calling on the widow in the parlor, the house treated by both armies as neutral ground, the last neutral ground in Tennessee, and she outlived her husband by 4 decades without ever remarrying, without ever leaving off the black, without ever quite leaving the office she had unofficially held. The books call her a hostess. The record shows the president's most trusted secretary, analyst, gatekeeper and counsellor, working before dawn by lamplight, unpaid and unappointed, at the centre of the hardest working presidency of her century. Number 4. The first thing you notice is the smell of paper. Not a sheet of it. Tons of it. You're a clerk in the White House mailroom in the spring of 1933, and the room has stopped being a room. It is a canyon. Grey canvas sacks stand shoulder high along every wall, sagging against each other like tired men, and more arrive with every post. Thousands upon thousands of letters a day since the inauguration on the 4th of March, until the overflow has to be carted to other buildings, and the count for the new First Lady alone, by the end of this first year, will run past 300,000 pieces, 300,000 letters, to the President's wife. You slit envelopes until your thumb blisters, and you read America, in the worst year of the Depression, and it reads like a moan. A quarter of the country is out of work. Farm wives writing that the bank has the land and the children have no shoes. Miners' letters on paper bags. Children asking Mrs. Roosevelt, not the President Mrs. Roosevelt, for a coat, for a bicycle, for their father's job back, because something in her face in the newsreels has convinced the desperate of the entire continent that this particular woman will actually read it. Here is the thing that keeps you at the table past quitting time. She does. Not all 300,000, no human could. But the operation built around that male is unlike anything this house has seen. Her secretary, Malvina Thompson, whom everyone calls Tommy, runs the sorting. The hardest cases go upstairs, and answers come back down in a steady stream, some typed for her signature, and a startling number in the First Lady's own galloping handwriting, with letters forwarded on to governors, to relief administrators, to cabinet officers, with a note attached that makes things move. You have seen those notes. They are short. They ask what can be done about this. And the men who receive them have learned that the question is not rhetorical, because she remembers and she follows up. And she has the President's ear every single day. Sometimes, hurrying along the corridor with a folder, you see her in motion. Always in motion. Tall, in sensible shoes, talking over her shoulder to Tommy at a pace the shorthand can barely hold. 2 days after the inauguration, on the 6th of March 1933, she did something no First Lady had ever done. She held a press conference. Her own. In the Red Room, 35 reporters, and by her rule, women only. Which meant overnight that every newspaper that wanted the First Lady's news had to hire at least one woman, or keep the one it has been thinking of firing. In the middle of the Depression, with newsrooms shedding staff, Eleanor Roosevelt quietly made several dozen women's jobs scandal-proof with a single standing rule. She would hold hundreds of those press conferences over the 12 years. That is the pattern of her you learn first from the mailroom, the warm gesture, and inside it, folded like a blade, the structural move. Number 4 is Eleanor Roosevelt. And let's be honest about the ranking, because you may be asking how the most influential First Lady in American history sits only 4th. Here is the honest answer on the spectrum we agreed to at the start. Half of Eleanor worked in daylight, in her own name, out loud, the crowds, the press conferences, the causes, and that half needs no detective work at all. But underneath the public, Eleanor ran a second, quieter operation the country never saw working. The reports laid on Franklin's desk at the end of the day, the appointments pressed through back channels, the positions floated in her column precisely so the White House could deny them. Tonight's measure is that inside operation, and even taken alone, even with the daylight half set aside, what remains is enormous. Start with what Franklin Roosevelt called her, in private and to aides, his eyes and ears. It was a job description, and it existed because of a fact the newsreels were built to hide. The President of the United States could not walk. Polio, 1921. The theatrical standing at podiums, the leg braces locked, the strong arms on the lectern, all of it managed. A president who cannot move through a coal town, a relief camp, a hospital ward unannounced needs someone who can, someone whose judgment maps exactly onto his needs, someone who cannot be flattered, managed, or fooled by an official tour. So she went. 40,000 miles a year in the early terms, down mines in Appalachia, into sharecroppers' cabins, through the relief projects, turning up where no advanced man had prepared the ground. The cartoon of the era, a coal miner deep underground looking up and saying, "Here comes Mrs. Roosevelt," was affectionate mockery of something the government had come to depend on. The president's most trusted inspector general wore a first lady's hat. She came back from every trip with the same weapon, the specific. Not conditions are poor. This camp, this ditch, these children's legs. At dinner, at the cocktail hour he mixed and she ignored. In memos he actually read. The reports landed. New dealers learned the vector. To reach the president's conscience, load Mrs. Roosevelt. Then the column. At the end of December 1935, she began publishing My Day, a syndicated newspaper column, 6 days a week, in her own name, on whatever she chose: relief policy, race, women's wages, a grandchild's visit, a book. 6 days a week for a quarter century, through and past the White House. No First Lady had ever had. No First Lady has had since. Her own standing national platform, independent of the administration, arriving on breakfast tables in millions of homes, and the administration learned to read it the way Kremlinologists read Pravda, because she used it. Positions the president could not yet take showed up in Eleanor's column first, floated like weather balloons. If the country howled, the White House could shrug. The First Lady speaks for herself. If the country nodded, policy followed. Deniable, disownable, and effective, the quiet mechanics inside the public voice. And race. The clearest case of her operating as the administration's other conscience. In February 1939, the Daughters of the American Revolution refused their Constitution Hall to the great contralto Marian Anderson because she was black. Eleanor Roosevelt resigned from the DAR, publicly, explaining herself in My Day in front of the whole country. And behind the scenes, the administration's men, with her hand plainly in it, arranged something better than any concert hall. On Easter Sunday, the 9th of April 1939, Marian Anderson stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and sang My Country, 'Tis of Thee to 75,000 people and a national radio audience, the Emancipator seated in marble at her back. The First Lady was not on the platform. She had learned precisely when her presence helped and when her fingerprints did. That is not celebrity. That is craft. When the war came, the operation went global. In October 1942, she flew to wartime Britain, inspecting American troops and blitzed cities for the president. And in August and September of 1943, she made a 5-week, 25,000-mile circuit of the South Pacific War Zone, 17 islands, Australia, New Zealand and Guadalcanal itself, as a Red Cross representative in a plain uniform. Admiral Halsey, who had opposed her coming as a nuisance and a risk, watched her walk hospital ward after hospital ward, not the quick photograph pass, but bed by bed, every bed, asking each boy his name and his hometown and what message she could carry to his mother, then writing the mothers, and the crusty admiral put on record what the whole theatre came to feel. She accomplished more good than any other visitor to his area, and she left him, in his own words, ashamed of his original surliness. Some of those boys' letters passed through mail rooms like yours. You know what her name meant at the bottom of a promise. She even, briefly, held actual office. Assistant Director of the Office of Civilian Defence from September 1941, the First Lady ever to hold a formal government post, and resigned it within months, in February 1942, when congressional attacks on her appointments made her a target that hurt the agency. She drew the correct conclusion. the one that defines her whole method. A title made her weaker. Outside the org chart, answerable to no one, married to the top of it, she was untouchable. Lewis Howe, the gnomish political operator who had trained them both, used to say she could be president herself. And after Franklin died at Warm Springs in April 1945, the suggestion was made to her seriously more than once. She declined, went to the brand new United Nations as an American delegate, and in December 1948 stood in Paris, while the General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the document her committee chairmanship had dragged into existence, and gave her a standing ovation. Harry Truman, whose wife you met at number 10, gave Eleanor the title history has kept, First Lady of the World. She ran more of her share of the White House in the open than anyone else tonight. Which is exactly why the three women ahead of her are ahead of her. Whatever showed on the surface, the substance of what they ran with the doors shut. Number 3. 2 place settings. That's all. You're a White House steward in the small dining room off the Oval Office on a Wednesday just before noon in the summer of 1977, laying a working lunch for 2, and the simplicity of the table is deceptive, because this is the strangest standing meeting in the United States government. The plates are plain. The menu is plain. The Carters run a famously frugal house. The trays of bottles you'd have carried 50 years earlier are unthinkable here. Grilled fish and iced tea now, and the president personally reviews expenses. Beside one plate you set water. Beside the other you leave room, because the second chair's occupant will arrive, as she always arrives, with a leather folder full of notes, an agenda, actual numbered items, prepared in her own office in the East Wing with her own chief of staff, a policy operation with a budget and org chart no First Lady before her ever had. At noon they come in, and the door closes. The President of the United States and Rosalind Carter. And what happens on the other side of that door every Wednesday is not lunch. It is a scheduled bilateral meeting between the presidency and its most trusted advisor, agenda circulated in advance. Aides have learned what the closed door means. Issues that stall in the West Wing all week have a way of resolving by Wednesday afternoon. You clear the plates afterward. The folder is always lighter going out. Here is the documented record of the woman historians will rank among the most powerful first ladies of the 20th century, and whom the press of her own era, half in admiration and half in alarm, named the Steel Magnolia. Begin where her power began, because it did not begin in Washington. Plains, Georgia, 1953. Jimmy Carter comes home from the Navy to run the family peanut business after his father's death, and Rosalind, married at 18, 3 sons before 25, takes over the books, accounts, weights, invoices, taxes. Within a few seasons she knows the business, by his own cheerful admission, better than he does. It is the Marion Starr pattern again, the independence pattern, the American political wife as the operation's actual comptroller. They argued as equals in the warehouse office, and the habit stuck. By the time he ran for governor of Georgia, and then, absurdly, improbably, for president, Jimmy who? She campaigned independently in 41 states, alone, giving her own speeches, keeping her own counsel, reporting back her own political intelligence, which was frequently sharper than the campaign's. So when they reached the White House in January 1977, the partnership didn't change. It simply acquired a federal budget. And almost immediately it produced the single most argued about fact of her tenure. Rosalind Carter began sitting in on cabinet meetings. Sitting in. The First Lady of the United States, in the cabinet room, along the wall with the note-takers, stenopad on her knee, silent, writing, while the secretaries of State and Defense and Treasury debated before the President. She never spoke. She was scrupulous about that, and said so plainly for the rest of her life. She asked no questions, offered no opinions in the room, took her notes, and left. Her explanation was disarming and completely in character. People across the country constantly asked her about administration policy, and she was tired of answering from ignorance. And the fastest way to know what her husband's government was doing was to watch it work. Washington did not find it disarming. Washington came unglued. Columnists demanded to know who elected her. The answer, nobody, which is the entire theme of tonight, did not slow either Carter down because the president's own position was serene and public. There was, he said, hardly anything he didn't discuss with Rosalind, and her judgment carried more weight with him than nearly anyone's. Mr. President, an interviewer once pressed, "On what subjects do you consult your wife?" And the reply was the whole doctrine in 4 words: on everything, essentially. That is where Rosalind Carter sits on tonight's spectrum, and it is worth saying plainly. Nothing about her was concealed. The chair in the cabinet room was visible. The criticism was public. The partnership was announced. What ran private was the substance. She never spoke in the room. She spoke afterward upstairs over the Wednesday lunch where it counted, and no columnist ever heard a word of it. The country could see the partnership perfectly. It could not see inside it. That is its own kind of closed door, the one everybody can point at and nobody can open. Then came June 1977, and the episode that separates Rosalind Carter from every predecessor on this list, including Eleanor. The president dispatched her 5 months into the term on an official diplomatic mission to Latin America. Not a goodwill tour, not ribbon cuttings, substantive state business. Jamaica, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela. 7 nations in under 2 weeks, some 12,000 miles, carrying the administration's actual positions on arms control, human rights, drug traffic, trade. She prepared like a principal because she was one. Weeks of briefings with State Department and National Security Council officials, stacks of country files mastered, Spanish lessons resumed. And down there she sat across the table from presidents and generals, some of them visibly startled to discover that the Senora had not come to visit orphanages, and conducted the meetings herself from notes on the merits, and cabled home reports the State Department treated as reporting, because that is what it was. The foreign ministries complained carefully. The American press complained loudly. She flew home, briefed the President and the Secretary of State, and went back to work. The precedent never fully rolled back. Every First Lady envoy since, every one, walks through the door Rosalind Carter opened in June 1977, and she had her own portfolio besides, and drove it like a cabinet officer. Mental health. The cause she had carried since the Georgia governorship, born of the campaign rope lines where cotton mill women told her about sons and sisters cared for in shame and secrecy. As First Lady, she became active honorary chair of the President's Commission on Mental Health within weeks of the inauguration. Its hearings, its report, its legislative push were hers in fact, if not in letterhead. And on the 7th of February, 1979, she went up to Capitol Hill and testified before a Senate subcommittee on behalf of what became the Mental Health Systems Act, the First Lady to give congressional testimony since Eleanor Roosevelt, and only the second in American history. The act passed in 1980. That a new administration defunded it a year later broke her heart and changed nothing about the fact. She had moved a federal statute through Congress. Inside the building, your steward's eye view catches what the cameras never did: the sheer administrative normality of her power. The East Wing under Rosalind ran as a professional policy shop, a First Lady's office with, for the first time, its own formally titled Chief of Staff at full salary, projects, deadlines, legislative trackers. She sat in on briefings for major addresses. She was consulted, the record is explicit, on the Camp David negotiations in September 1978, where she kept her own detailed notes running to hundreds of pages while her husband locked Begin and Sadat in the Maryland woods, on the Panama Canal fight, on personnel, on the political costs of the Malaise period, where her advice, characteristically, was harder-edged than his instincts. That was the standing joke with teeth, confirmed by both of them across 40 years of interviews. Of the two, Rosalind was the political one, the tactical one, the one who never forgot an enemy or forgave a betrayal easily, the one who would have won the second term. He governed by engineering. She counted votes. They left Washington in January 1981, wounded by landslide, and then did something no defeated presidential couple had done. They got better. 4 more decades, the Carter Center, the elections monitored, the diseases nearly eradicated, the houses built. The two of them working side by side into their 90s, the longest marriage in presidential history, 77 years, until her death in November 2023 with Jimmy, ancient and unbreakable at her side, asked late in life about the criticism, about the cabinet meetings, the summits, the audacity of an unelected wife inside the machinery. She never once apologized, and her answer was always some version of the same steel and magnolia sentence. She had the president's ear every night, she said, and she intended to use it for the people who had no other way in. Number 2. The calendar is the first thing you see every morning, and the calendar has colours. You are a young staffer in the White House scheduling operation in the autumn of 1986, and the master calendar you help maintain, the document that governs the movements of the President of the United States, the most protected and consequential schedule on Earth, has certain days marked green, certain days marked red, and certain days marked yellow. Green days are good days. Things may be scheduled on green days: departures, summits, announcements, the signing of documents, Air Force One wheels up. Red days are dangerous days. Nothing important may be scheduled on a red day, and if something important has somehow landed on one, it will be moved, and you will be the one who moves it, phoning some furious advance man to explain, without explaining, that the date is simply no longer available. Yellow days are uncertain. Treat them as red. You do not know where the colours come from. That is the truth you will tell for the rest of your life, and it will be accurate. The colours come down from the Chief of Staff's office, and the Chief of Staff's office gets them from the residents, and past that point the trail vanishes into the East Wing like a corridor with the lights off. What you know is operational. The colours rule. State visits have bent around them. The timing of presidential announcements, of departures as Geneva and Reykjavik, of press conferences, has bent around them, and less than 2 years from this autumn, with the administration still in office, the Chief of Staff himself will publish his memoir, and the whole country will find out what the colours were. Because here is what the colours were. They were astrology, the horoscope of Ronald Wilson Reagan, 40th President of the United States, as cast in San Francisco by an astrologer named Joan Quigley, relayed by telephone to the First Lady of the United States, translated by her into green, red and yellow, and imposed through the Chief of Staff, Donald Regan, who kept the colour-coded calendar on his desk and confessed it, stunned and bitter, in his 1988 memoir, on the schedule of the leader of the free world. Number 2 is Nancy Reagan. And if you think the astrology is the story, you have it exactly backwards. The astrology is the keyhole. Look through it and you see the story. That the president's schedule, his time, his exposure, his movements, the raw material of the presidency itself, belonged in the final analysis not to his staff, not to his party, not to the political geniuses of the West Wing, but to his wife. The colours were merely the moment the arrangement left fingerprints. Understand where it came from, because it did not come from superstition. It came from the 30th of March, 1981. 69 days into the presidency, outside the Washington Hilton, a disturbed young man put a revolver's worth of shots into the presidential party, and one ricochet under Ronald Reagan's left arm, an inch from his heart, and very nearly killed him. Far more nearly than the country was told that week. Nancy Reagan reached the hospital before the truth had even stabilized, and something in her never left that emergency room again. She had been protective before. The protectiveness now became total, and when an old California acquaintance, Quigley, claimed the danger of that day had been visible in the president's chart, Nancy did not laugh. She had almost watched her husband die on a sidewalk. She would take help from the stars themselves if the stars would keep him breathing. You may judge her from inside that emergency room. But the schedule was only the visible edge of the operating power, and the operating power was the real substance of Nancy Reagan, and the professionals knew it long before the public did. They called her, among themselves, the Missus, and the unsentimental ones stated the rule plainly. The fastest way out of the Reagan White House was to be marked down by her as bad for Ronnie. Because Ronald Reagan, sunny, vast, unknowable Ronald Reagan, had one profound managerial flaw, acknowledged by nearly everyone who served him. He could not fire anybody. He avoided personal conflict the way other men avoid pain. He assumed good faith in whoever was in the room with him, which meant the indispensable dark work of any presidency, judging the courtiers, detecting the self-dealers, removing the failed, was left undone by the president. It was not left undone. Nancy did it. The record, memoir after memoir, hers included, shows her hand in the rise and fall of half the senior staff of that administration. Campaign managers eased out. National security advisers she distrusted worn down. Aides who served her husband's interest promoted. Aides who served their own quietly marked. She worked by telephone endlessly from the residence, the private lines, to a small circle of confidants, checking, comparing, triangulating, and she watched the press with an intensity the press office itself couldn't match, because her metric was single and incorruptible. Is this man making Ronnie's presidency better or worse? She had no ideology worth the name. Ideologues on both flanks discovered this with horror. She had a client, and in 1987 all of it, the vigilance, the telephone, the patience, converged on one man and produced the most spectacular demonstration of unelected power in the modern White House. Donald Regan, the Chief of Staff, former Merrill Lynch chairman, imperious, certain, fond of saying he ran the shop. Through 1986, the Iran-Contra scandal broke over the administration, arms secretly sold to Tehran, money channeled to the Nicaraguan Contras, and threatened for a genuine historical moment to consume the Reagan presidency the way Watergate consumed Nixon's. Nancy watched her husband, then 75 and recovering that year from cancer surgery, wander shaken through the wreckage while his chief of staff guarded his own reputation, quarrelled over access and, unforgivably in her ledger, hung up the telephone on the First Lady in the middle of an argument. He might as well have resigned on the spot and did not know it. What followed, documented from every side of it, was a campaign. Months of pressure on the president, allies recruited, elder statesmen enlisted to carry the verdict inward, the drumbeat sustained through the winter with a persistence her husband's aides described with the exhausted respect of men watching a tide come in. Ronald Reagan resisted. Conflict again. Always conflict. And Nancy persisted. On the 26th of February 1987, the Tower Board delivered its Iran-Contra report, scalding the Chief of Staff's management. On the 27th, Don Regan resigned. He learned the identity of his already chosen successor, former Senator Howard Baker, not from the president, but from the television news. His revenge was the memoir, the one with the astrology in it, which is why you, the scheduler, eventually learned what the colours meant. It was aimed to wound her. Read now, it does the opposite of what he intended. Page after page, it documents that the most powerful man Wall Street ever sent to Washington was removed from the White House by the First Lady of the United States. And here is the fact that lifts Nancy Reagan above mere palace combat into number 2. The biggest thing she pushed was peace. Through the first term, the hard men around the administration were content with the evil empire, with confrontation as policy and rhetoric. Nancy, by her own account and the account of the diplomats who found her their unlikely ally, wanted her husband remembered as a peacemaker, and pressed him, steadily, domestically, at the hour of the day when only she had the floor, toward engagement with Moscow. The summits came. Geneva in November 1985, Reykjavik in October 1986, Washington in December 1987, with Gorbachev signing away an entire class of nuclear missiles in the East Room. Historians will argue forever about how to apportion that credit, and the president's own convictions were real. But on the short list of people who bent Ronald Reagan toward the table, every serious account of those years includes, without smiling, the First Lady. She outlived him by 12 years, guarding the flame, and the verdict on her hardened into something close to consensus among the staff who had feared her. The Reagan presidency, whatever one thought of it, does not survive its second term intact without her. She controlled the door, the calendar and the personnel file from a wing of the house with no line on any org chart. Nobody voted for her. Everybody moved to her colours. Number 1. You are a White House usher in the winter of 1919, and the president's door has been closed for 6 weeks. You stand your post in the great upstairs corridor of the mansion, where the carpets swallow footsteps and the radiators tick against the December cold, and you can measure the crisis of the United States government by the things that no longer happen. The president no longer comes down to his office. The cabinet no longer meets with him. Congressmen no longer ride up in the elevator. The stream of aides, secretaries, generals, and ambassadors that used to flow along this corridor like water in a mill race has simply stopped. The second floor of the White House has gone as quiet as a private sickroom, because that is what it now is, and at the centre of the quiet is a door, and the door stays closed. What passes through that door you can count on your fingers. Dr. Grayson, several times a day, grey-faced, saying nothing, trained nurses in shifts, trays, and papers, memoranda, dispatches, bills passed by Congress, the entire inbound paperwork of the Presidency of the United States, carried to the door in the hands of exactly one person and carried back out, days or weeks later or never, by the same hands, hers, Edith Bolling Galt Wilson, second wife of the President, married to him just 4 years ago this month. Tall, handsome, watchful, a Virginia widow who ran her late husband's jewellery business before she ran this, and who moves along this corridor with a composure that the staff have stopped mistaking for calm. You have watched her stop the Secretary of State's memoranda at that threshold like a customs inspector. You have watched senators, actual United States senators, stand in this corridor explaining themselves to her, and being weighed, and being sent away. The typed queries come up from the executive offices, urgent, stacked. What goes back down, when anything goes back down at all, are the margins of those same papers filled with penciled notes in a big looping hand that is not the President's. The President says, the President directs, the President wishes. Whether the President has said, directed, or wished anything at all, whether the President behind that door can, is a question you are careful never to ask out loud, even in the usher's room, even at night. But you were on duty in early October. You saw Dr. Grayson run. You know what this house knows, and the country outside can only suspect loudly, in the Senate and in the papers, without ever being able to confirm it, that on the 2nd of October, 1919, the President of the United States was found on the floor of his bathroom, and that whatever got up from that floor and into that bed is not the man who went on the Western tour in September. The rumour that something is wrong is everywhere. How wrong? That is the secret, and this corridor is where it is kept. Here is what happened, with the dates in order, because this one, the crown of tonight's countdown, must be exact. In the autumn of 1919, Woodrow Wilson staked everything on the League of Nations, the treaty he had brought home from Paris, the covenant he believed would make the World War the last one, and the Senate, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, would not swallow it whole. So Wilson went over the Senate's head to the country. In September, he launched a speaking tour that remains one of the most punishing things a president has ever done to himself. 8,000 miles in under a month, some 40 major speeches from Ohio to the Pacific coast and back, 2 and 3 a day, from open cars and flag-draped platforms, in heat and dust, to crowds of tens of thousands without amplification. A 62-year-old man with years of hidden vascular trouble behind him, hurling his voice at the continent. Through it the headaches came and worsened until the headaches were blinding. On the 25th of September, at Pueblo, Colorado, he gave what those who heard it called the greatest speech of the tour, weeping crowds and all. And that night, westbound in the private car, he broke. The remaining tour was cancelled. The train ran straight through to Washington, and photographs from those days show a man walking off the platform with his face already subtly wrong. 6 days later, on the morning of the 2nd of October, 1919, Edith found him unconscious on the bathroom floor of the White House. A massive stroke, a clot in the brain, had destroyed the left side of his body, face, arm, leg. Dr. Cary Grayson, his physician and devoted friend, came out of the room that morning and said it in 5 words to the staff. "My God, the president is paralyzed," and then never said it again. Not to the press, not to the cabinet, not to the Congress of the United States. What the country was told that autumn was that the president was suffering from nervous exhaustion and needed rest. What the government experienced was stranger than anything in American constitutional history before or since. The presidency did not pass to the vice president. Thomas Marshall kept so far from the truth that he reportedly learned the real gravity of things from a newspaper man, and who wanted no part of seizing an office that might make him a usurper. The presidency did not pass to the cabinet. When Secretary of State Robert Lansing convened the cabinet on his own authority to keep the routine machinery turning, the White House marked it down as something close to disloyalty. And when Lansing kept doing it, some 20-odd meetings over the following months, he was forced from office for it in February 1920, with a letter of cold presidential fury whose actual authorship historians still debate. The presidency did not pass at all. It stayed behind the closed door, and the door was Edith. She described the arrangement herself 20 years later in her 1939 memoir, and gave it the name history has kept, her stewardship. Her account of it deserves to be quoted almost exactly, because it is at once the defence and the confession. "I studied every paper," she wrote, "sent from the different secretaries or senators, and tried to digest and present in tabloid form the things that had to go to the president. She decided, she, alone, what was important and what was not, what he saw and what he never saw, who entered and who was turned away, when a matter could wait and when it must be presented." And then the famous sentence, the one every historian of the era can recite, "I myself never made a single decision regarding the disposition of public affairs. The only decision that was mine," she insisted, "was what was important and what was not." Sit with that sentence in the dark for a moment, because it is the entire theme of tonight, compressed to a diamond. The only decision that was mine was what was important and what was not. In a government of 2 million employees, in the aftermath of a world war, with a treaty dying in the Senate, with strikes rolling through steel and coal, with prices rioting and radicals bombing and Europe starving, deciding what is important and what reaches the chief executive and when, and framed by whose covering note is not the absence of power, it is the concentrated essence of it. Every chief of staff in the modern White House holds a piece of that power and is confirmed by nobody and feared by everybody. For the better part of a year, at its most absolute in the first 6 months, before the president began meeting his cabinet again in the spring of 1920, the whole of it was held by a Virginia widow with no staff, no title, no oath, and no constitutional existence whatsoever, working from a chair beside a sick bed. The men of the government knew, or half knew, and their fury had nowhere to go. On Capitol Hill, Senator Albert Fall of New Mexico, yes, the same Albert Fall you met at Florence Harding's poker table, prison-bound in his future, stood up and gave the arrangement its immortal name. "We have petticoat government," he thundered. "Mrs. Wilson is president." And it was Fall, deliciously, whom the closed door finally opened for, in the scene the staff would retell for 40 years. December the 5th, 1919. The Senate, hunting evidence of presidential incapacity, contrives a pretext, a foreign policy matter requiring consultation, and sends a delegation of 2 to the sick room, Senator Hitchcock, a friend, and Senator Fall, an enemy, coming, as everyone understood, not to consult, but to inspect. What Fall walked into was a stage set, and the stage manager was Edith. The president propped and arranged in the shadowed bed, his paralysed left side away from the visitors and under the covers, the lighting composed, the papers of the day arranged on the coverlet as though just reviewed, the timing chosen for one of his good hours. Wilson, whose mind on his good days could still flash, performed. Edith stood by with a pad and pencil, taking down every word said. So, she explained, there would be no misquotation afterward. Fall, wrong-footed into courtesy, pressed the president's hand and said, "We have all been praying for you, Mr. President." And Wilson, the story comes down from the room itself, answered, "Which way, Senator?" The delegation withdrew and reported the president in command of his faculties. The inspection Edith had staged became the government's official reassurance. The door closed again. You, the usher, watched all of it from the corridor, and one of you wrote it down. Erwin Hood Hoover, Ike, the chief usher of the White House, who served that house for 42 years under 10 presidents, left in his memoir the household's plain testimony of those months, the president helpless behind the door, the isolation near total, and all business, in Ike Hoover's words, going through Mrs. Wilson. The stewardship was not a legend of hostile senators. The people who carried the trays confirmed it. What did it cost, this quiet regency? Historians still audit the bill. The Treaty of Versailles and American membership in the League of Nations went down in the Senate on the 19th of November 1919, and again, finally, on the 19th of March 1920. And in the second defeat, the decisive fraction was Democrats obeying instructions from the sickroom to accept no compromise on Lodge's reservations, instructions transmitted through Edith's channel, from a mind whose flexibility the stroke had rigidified along with everything else. There were moments, the record suggests, when a compromise was reachable, when men like Hitchcock begged the sickroom for an inch. Edith herself, in her memoir, describes carrying one such plea to her husband, urging him, for her own sake, to accept the reservations and be done, and Wilson refusing, "Little girl, don't you desert me." She never pressed him again. The League died. Whether a healthy Wilson would have bent, whether anyone but Edith could ever have been in a position to bend him, is one of the great unanswerable questions of the century that followed, with its terrible second act that the League had been dreamed up to prevent. She was no villain, and tonight owes her that plainly. She sought none of this. She was protecting the man she loved on the advice of his doctors, who told her, and this is documented too, that his recovery depended on shielding him from every strain, and that resignation might kill him. Every choice she made was the choice of a wife, made inside a constitutional void that the founders had left gaping. Nothing in the Constitution of 1919 said what to do with a president alive but broken. It took the country until 1967 and the 25th Amendment to write the rulebook that her stewardship proved was missing. That amendment is, among other things, a monument to her, the law America wrote to make sure there could never be another Edith. She lived until 1961, long enough to see the rulebook argued into being, long enough to ride one snowy January morning that final year in the inaugural procession of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a woman who had, by the plain testimony of the ushers, the senators, and her own memoir, operated the presidency of the United States, and outlived nearly everyone who could argue about it. The first woman to run the White House. The newspapers of a later age would call her the first woman president in all but name. She would have rejected every word of it. She kept the verdicts of history at the same door where she kept the Secretary of State. The door stays closed. That is number one. But before you go off duty, stay in the corridor a little longer, because a countdown of 10 is an act of cruelty as much as an act of order, and the house knows it. For every woman who made tonight's list, there were others standing just outside it, in the shadows between the portraits, and some of them came so close to the cut that leaving them unnamed would be its own kind of untruth. So walk the corridor one more time, slowly, past the ones who almost made the list, and let each of them have her minute. Think of it as the receiving line at the end of the evening, when the music has stopped and the guests are nearly gone and the truth comes out in low voices. Here, first, is a woman who was never a wife at all. Harriet Lane, in the portrait with the low-cut gown that scandalised and delighted the capital in equal measure. Her uncle, James Buchanan, was the only bachelor ever elected president, and when he took office in March of 1857, he brought his orphaned niece, 26 years old, educated, shrewd, gold-haired, to run the social side of the most socially impossible White House in history. Think about her assignment for a moment. The country is coming apart. Kansas is bleeding. Senators no longer speak to each other. One has been caned nearly to death at his desk. And into this she must seat dinner parties, Southern fire-eaters and Northern abolitionists at one table, week after week, arranging the chairs of men who will be shooting at each other within 4 years. She did it with a protocol officer's precision and a poker player's face, deciding precedents, managing feuds, giving the dying antebellum capital its last glittering seasons. The newspapers, reaching for a way to describe a woman who was not a wife, but was unmistakably the first lady of the establishment, began using exactly that phrase, the first lady of the land, and it stuck to her and then to the office itself. The title every woman in tonight's story carried came into common use, in large part around a niece. Ships were a name for her. A revenue cutter called Harriet Lane fired some of the earliest naval shots of the Civil War, which is its own strange poetry. And when she died, she left her fortune to found a children's clinic in Baltimore that still treats children today. She almost made the list. What kept her off it is the measure itself. She ran the house brilliantly, but the presidency she served ran nothing at all, and there was no power in that building for anyone to secretly hold. A few steps further on, in the deeper shadow, hangs a woman most Americans have never seen a picture of, Eliza McCardle Johnson. She married Andrew Johnson in Greenville, Tennessee, when she was 16 and he was 18, a tailor who had never spent a day in school. The town story, polished smooth by generations of telling, says she taught him to read. The documented version is only a little more modest. He could puzzle out letters when she met him. It was Eliza, the cobbler's educated daughter, who sat with him in the tailor shop and taught him to write a decent hand and to figure, who read to him while he stitched, who took the raw force of him and gave it tools. Every speech Andrew Johnson ever thundered on a stump, and he became one of the great rough orators of his age, had her patience somewhere at the bottom of it. By the time the assassination of Lincoln threw him into the presidency in April 1865, Eliza was an invalid, wasted by tuberculosis, and the Washington that expected a hostess got instead roomer. She took a small room on the second floor, appeared in public perhaps twice in 4 years, and from that room, this is the testimony of the staff who adored her, she read every newspaper in the capital and functioned as her husband's private intelligence service and his only unconditional ally. She clipped what he needed to see. She withheld by her own system what would only enrage him. The staff said she fed him the good news at breakfast and saved the bad for evening, when she could manage his temper herself, which no one else on earth could do. Through the impeachment winter of 1868, with the President of the United States on trial before the Senate and the whole government holding its breath, the quietest room in Washington was hers. The bodyguard William Crook, who served that White House and wrote it all down, carried her the news of the acquittal, one vote, and recorded her response. She was sewing. She said she had known it all along. She almost made the list. And on pure influence per public appearance, no one in this story touches her. Now a jump of a century to a portrait in yellow. Claudia Alta Taylor of Karnak, Texas, called Ladybird since infancy, married to Lyndon Baines Johnson, and here is the fact about her that the official histories took decades to weigh properly. She was the businessman of the family. In 1943, with a modest inheritance, she bought a struggling Austin radio station called KTBC. She, not he, her money, her signature, her management. And over the following decades, while her husband climbed through the Senate to the vice presidency, she built it into a broadcasting fortune. The empire that made the Johnsons rich was run, its books balanced and its managers hired and fired by the soft-spoken woman with the camellia manners. And when the presidency came to them the terrible way it came, in Dallas in November 1963, she brought that same operator's mind into the East Wing. She was the First Lady with a press secretary and chief of staff of her own, a professional staff structure every successor inherited. She recorded on tape one of the most remarkable documents in White House history, an audio diary, hundreds of hours, and on those tapes you can hear her doing something no aide dared, grading the President of the United States, reviewing his press conferences and speeches to his face and behind his back with the unsparing eye of a station owner reviewing talent. The delivery too rushed here, the anger showing there, and Lyndon Johnson, who devoured lesser critics whole, took it because her ratings were the only ones he trusted. In October 1964, she did what no First Lady had done, campaigned alone against real hatred through the Deep South. Her husband's Civil Rights Act had just set on fire. The Lady Bird Special, a whistle-stop train, 4 days, 8 states, some 1,600 miles and nearly 50 stops, heckled and booed and threatened, and she stood on the rear platform in her gloves and said, in that soft Alabama-adjacent voice, that she was among friends, and finished every speech. And in 1965 she pushed a piece of legislation, the Highway Beautification Act, so personally, lobbying members, working the phones, that official Washington called it Lady Bird's Bill, the first law in American history nicknamed for a First Lady. She missed the list by a hair, and the hair is this. Her power, like Eleanor's, ran mostly in the open. Keep walking. A small portrait, easy to pass. Lou Henry Hoover, the first woman in America to take a degree in geology, out of Stanford, where she met a mining engineer named Herbert. She had lived through the Boxer Siege in China in 1900, carried a pistol during it, worked the barricades, and spoke 5 languages, one of which was Mandarin, which produced the single most delicious security arrangement in White House history. When the President and First Lady wished to speak privately in front of staff or guests, they simply switched to Chinese. She gave the first regular radio broadcasts ever made by a First Lady, and in 1929 she committed what half the country's newspapers treated as an act of war. She invited Jessie DePriest, the wife of the first black congressman elected in the 20th century, to tea at the White House, exactly as protocol required, and served it herself, and let the editorials scream. a scientist, a linguist, a woman of quiet iron. The Depression drowned that presidency and took her reputation down with it unfairly. She waits in the corridor and she can wait. Geologists understand time. And here, in the light-filled frame, the one everybody stops at, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, 31 years old at the inauguration, the youngest since Francis Cleveland. The world remembers the pillbox hats and forgets the operation. What she ran flawlessly. The wholesale rescue of the White House itself, the building you've been walking through all night, which she found furnished, she said, like a convention hotel, and remade room by room into a museum of the American story, hunting down the scattered originals, charming donors out of Monroe's own furniture, pushing through Congress the law that made the collection permanent so no future administration could sell it off again. Then on the 14th of February 1962, she took the entire nation through it on television, room by room, in that whispering voice. 56 million viewers, an Emmy, and a lesson in soft power that government studied. In Paris in 1961, she so completely conquered France, in French, that the President of the United States introduced himself to the press, famously as the man who had accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris. And in the worst week, in November 1963, it was she, 20 minutes of history on her pink suit, who designed the funeral that held the country together, borrowing from Lincoln's, walking behind the caisson, teaching a small boy to salute. She ran images, memory, meaning. Everything, in fact, except the government, which is the only reason she is in this corridor and not in the countdown. One more, and this one is the argument you were maybe already having with me. Hillary Rodham Clinton. In January 1993, 5 days into her husband's term, she was appointed, formally publicly by the President, to chair the administration's task force on national healthcare reform, the largest domestic policy initiative of its era. She took an office not in the East Wing but in the West Wing, the First Lady ever stationed there, steps from the working machinery. She ran a policy process of hundreds of officials, and in September 1993 she testified on the plan before 5 committees of Congress across a single week, fielding hostile questioning for hours from memory, without notes, and even her enemies came away shaken by the command of it. By every raw measure of official power, she exceeds nearly everyone on tonight's list, and that is exactly why she is not on it. Her role had no hidden half at all. It was announced from a podium, litigated in federal court, fought over in every newspaper in the country, and it is all still too close to weigh. The arguments are living arguments. The memoirs are still being written. The ushers who watched are still keeping their silence. Tonight's countdown measured the hidden hand at the distance history needs to measure anything. Her chapter belongs to a different episode. The moment the door finally opened, and the arrangement 2 centuries of ushers had watched in silence walked out into the light, and the country discovered it had opinions. That is the end of the receiving line. There are others. There are always others. Edith Roosevelt reading every paper in Washington and briefing Theodore, who trusted her judgment of men above his own. Grace Coolidge, forbidden by her husband to say anything at all, and beloved precisely for how much she said without words. Mamie Eisenhower, who ran the residence like a brigadier and summed up her entire public doctrine in one line, that she had only one career, and his name was Ike. While behind that line the staff knew every menu, every account, and every corridor of the mansion answered to her. But the candles are burning down, and the 10 who are counted are waiting, and even the longest evening in that house has to end. Notice, though, what the almost list just taught you, because it is the last lesson of the night, and the house has been building to it for 200 years. Add these women to the 10, and the pattern stops looking like exception and starts looking like architecture. In every generation, without a single interruption, from the wet plaster of 1800 to the television lights of the modern age, the building has run on this second unwritten office. The niece, the invalid, the businesswoman, the geologist, the editor, the widow with the pencil. The Constitution never mentioned her. The government never paid her. The house never once functioned without her. And now the countdown is over, and you can take the uniform off, set down the tray, hang up the livery coat with the brass buttons. You've been a steward on a dark river and a waiter in a candlelit crush, a housemaid with a candle in a freezing unfinished mansion, an usher in the snow and an usher in the terrible quiet, a houseman with contraband on a tray, a messenger in the dark, a mail clerk in a canyon of canvas sacks, a steward laying 2 plates, a scheduler staring at a calendar full of colours, 10 posts, 10 administrations, a century and a half of the same house. And notice, before you let it all go, what you actually saw from those posts. Not conspiracies, not stolen power, except perhaps once, at the very end, and even that was a kind of love. What you saw over and over was quieter and stranger than any conspiracy. Competence, arriving where the Constitution had left a blank. A government that on paper was all men, running in practice on the judgment of women it refused to name. Women reading the papers before dawn, editing the speeches after dinner, staging the sick room, mixing the drinks, marking the columns, taking the notes, holding the door. The house knew. The house always knew. The presidents knew. And most of them, in the privacy of their letters, admitted it in almost identical words a century apart. Full partner, the boss, the duchess, none but Sarah, on everything essentially. Only the country outside the gates was surprised each time when the memoirs finally came out. The corridors are empty now. This is the hour of the house you were never paid to see, the hour the staff always loved best. The last office light is out in the west wing. The radiators tick as they cool. Somewhere below, in the kitchens, tomorrow's bread is rising in the dark. The portraits hang in their long rows, the men in oils gazing at the middle distance, and between them, here and there, the women, painted with their hands folded, as if their hands had only ever been folded. Walk the corridor one last time, softly, the way the night ushers walk it. Past the door where Edith sat with her pencil, past the room where Abigail's laundry lines once hung, marble and gold now, chandeliers where the wet linen dripped. Past the study that once smelled of cigars and whiskey and risk. Past the little dining room where 2 plates were laid every Wednesday. The house holds all of it at once. Houses do. That is what houses are for. And the strange thing, the thing you understand only now at the end in the dark, is that this was never really a story about power. Power was just the shape of it. Underneath, it was a story about being trusted, about being the one person in the world whose judgment the most burdened man alive could lean on at midnight, with the door closed when all the clever men had gone home. Every one of these 10 women carried that weight without a title, without a salary, without an oath, and carried it well or carried it badly, but carried it every single day, and most of them carried it straight out of history's sight. Nobody voted for them. The house remembers them anyway. It remembers them the way old houses remember. in habits nobody can explain anymore. The staff call certain rooms by names that stopped making sense generations ago. Perhaps somewhere in the florist's shop, the mantles still get banked some particular way at Christmas because Jacqueline Kennedy once liked them banked that way, and no one working the ladder remembers that is the reason. You could believe the usher's office keeps its logs with a fullness that goes back to Ike Hoover, the man who stood in the quiet of the second floor in the winter of 1919, and whose memoir is a large part of how we know what happened there at all, because the people carrying the trays turned out to be the ones writing it down. Institutions have memories the way rivers have beds, carved by pressure, invisible from the surface, directing everything. And the office itself, the unwritten one, kept evolving after our 10, in exactly the direction the countdown pointed. The staffs grew. The East Wing acquired press secretaries, chiefs of staff, policy shops, budgets. What Sarah Polk did alone by lamplight became, in time, an operation of dozens. What Edith Wilson improvised in a constitutional void became case law and amendment and briefing book procedure. The modern building has rules now for nearly everything those 10 women had to invent. Succession, incapacity, disclosure, the reach of a spouse, nearly everything. But no rule book has ever managed to regulate the actual mechanism, the one every chapter of tonight turned on, because the mechanism is 2 chairs and a closed door and the end of the day, and you cannot subpoena a marriage. Somewhere in the house, on any night you choose across 2 centuries, the scene repeats. The details change costume. Candlelight becomes gaslight, becomes the blue glow of a television left on with the sound off. But the scene does not change. A tired man says, "Tell me what you really think." And someone with no title, no salary, and no oath tells him. That sentence, spoken in the dark, has shaped more American history than most treaties. It shaped the speeches you heard tonight and the firings you watched, and the wars that widened or narrowed, the appointments made and unmade, the treaty that died behind a closed door, and the missiles signed away in the East Room. The historians came later with their footnotes and did their best. The ushers were already there. The ushers were always already there. You could stand your post forever, turning all this over. That is the occupational disease of night duty in a house like this, the thinking. The corridor is warm now, or warm enough. The radiators have gone from ticking to silence, which means the boilers are banked. Down in the kitchen, someone has left one low light burning over the bread, the way someone always has. Outside the tall windows, the snow, or the rain, or the soft summer dark, whichever century you like, is doing what it does to cities at 3 a.m, which is to erase them gently, one street at a time, until even the capital of the United States is just lit windows and quiet. Let the house grow quiet now. It is very late, in every century at once. Late enough that the centuries have stopped keeping to their own floors. On the service stairs going down, you could pass the boy carrying Florence's ice bucket coming up, and neither of you would find it strange. In the pantry, Dolly's ice cream moulds and Rosalind's iced tea pitchers stand on the same shelf, and the shelf does not object. The house has always been better than the country at letting its eras live together. It has had to be. It never once got to empty itself completely between tenants. Somebody always stayed on. Somebody always carried the way things were done across the gap from one administration to the next. The way you carry a full cup down a dark hallway, slowly, evenly, watching nothing but the level. That somebody was never elected either. Write it down as the last entry into night's ledger. The house itself has always been run by people whose names appear on no ballot. The wives, and the ushers, and the cooks, and you. Tomorrow, in that house, the paperwork will come up the stairs again. Tomorrow the door will open and close, and somebody unelected and unrecorded will decide once again what is important and what is not. Tomorrow there will be schedules and speeches and senators. But that's tomorrow. Tomorrow belongs to the ushers of the morning shift. Right now there is only the corridor and the ticking radiators and the long rows of quiet portraits and you. You've done your service tonight. You saw everything. You said nothing. You were quiet enough, and careful enough, and patient enough. And that was the whole art, the art all of them mastered, the art the house taught everyone who lived there long enough, that the quietest person in the room is very often the one holding it up. So let the countdown fade now, number by number, the way lamplight fades down a long hallway. Let Bess fold her pencil into the speech draft and rest. Let Dolly's candles gutter out over the empty drawing room, the last carriage rolling home. Let Abigail bank the 13 fires and blow out the candle over the unfinished letter. Let Nellie's cherry trees stand dark and patient by the water, 100 springs deep in bloom. Let Florence cover the card table and turn down the lamps. Let Sarah's window, the one you watched from the avenue, finally go dark. Let Eleanor's typewriter fall silent at last, mid-column, the rest of the sentence keeping until morning. Let Rosalind close the leather folder. Let Nancy set down the telephone. Let Edith put away the pencil and the pad and sit back in the chair by the bed and close her eyes. Let them all rest. They earned it in a currency history is only now learning to count, and let yourself rest with them. Let your shoulders come down from wherever the day has held them. Let your hands go loose, the way hands go loose when the last tray has been carried and the last door has been locked. Let your breathing slow to the pace of a night corridor, long, unhurried, nowhere to be. Centuries will pass. The house you walk tonight will change beyond recognition, as it always has. Wings will be added and gutted and rebuilt. The staircases will move. The office that was a bedroom will become a library that becomes something no one has thought of yet. But there will always be a corridor and a door at the end of it, and 2 people behind the door, one of them elected and one of them not, talking quietly at the very end of the day about what actually matters. Some things don't change. The last opinion of the night doesn't change. You're warm enough now, safe enough, tired enough, in the good way, the way the staff were tired at the end of a long state dinner, when everything had gone right and nothing had been seen that shouldn't be. You have a bed and a quiet room and a door of your own that no senator is waiting behind. That's more than most of the people in this story could say on their hardest nights. That's enough. So let it come. Let sleep take you the way the night took that great house, floor by floor, light by light, until only one lamp was left, and then none. Let the corridors of your mind empty out like hallways after midnight. Let the day's papers sort themselves into someone else's hands. Let the voices fade, the senators, the schedulers, the whole loud century, until they are only the murmur of a reception 3 rooms away, and then not even that. Let your thoughts slow and soften and finally stop. The house is quiet. The door is closed. Everything important has been decided for a night, and none of it for once was yours to carry. You've earned this rest. Take it. And dream of whatever dreams may come, of candlelight and snowfall, of cherry trees and slow rivers, of long corridors where your footsteps make no sound at all. Good night.